the work of the European historians, and there seems to be so little attention paid to them in the 200 years of the splendor of the Mughal rule in India.
Yes, Rumina, that's a very interesting point, and it's something that goes to the very core of what I like to do when I'm writing, and I hope that there's a lot more of this, in the years to come, is the fact that, as the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie says, that there's a danger of the story told from the single point of view, which is all of the colonial countries, we tend to grow up reading history seen through the lens of the colonial writers. So even when I was growing up, and when I got older, I was interested to note that I had a sense of nostalgia for things that I have never experienced myself, whether it's a cucumber sandwich or mild summer suns, the mild summer sun or daffodils in the breeze. And I started to think, that my mind has been colonized because I have grown up reading British literature. And, so it's very important because all your memories, all your past, it becomes embedded in this language. And instead of learning about maybe the lotuses and the koel and the Indian climate and things like that, we have a disconnect from our sense of history, which is located in Indian time and space. So this is something I wanted to do in my writing, is to change this filter around completely so that we are reading things from the indigenous point of view and thereby seeing the British and the French and the Italians, all the Europeans, through that lens. So it was important for me to remember that at this time, as Dr. Tharoor has said, I think, India was producing a quarter of the world's GDP. That was what a huge and powerful empire we were. So I wanted to bring things back around so that we place ourselves firmly in this context. And why were the Europeans there in the first place? It was because of this wealth. They were attracted to this wealth. But for the Mughals, they were just somewhere at the periphery of their vision, barely visible to them. So I wanted the reader, when they read my books, to understand this, to get into the reality of this space.
And not just that, Ira, what we also discover while we go through schools and colleges, that it seems that the British are this major presence in India that had to be displaced, who had to be ousted from the country in order to win our nationhood. And so we are always sort of in antagonism with the British. And therefore, not only do we read a lot of British accounts, but we also hear more than any other power in this great tapestry that you speak of, we hear only about the British. But it's only about after reading this book that you realize that the Mughals were such a major presence. So possibly historians, and I don't only mean the European historians here, have also attempted to create this enormous divide between the Hindus and the Muslims by completely marginalizing the role that the Muslims played, or the Mughals particularly played, in the shaping of Indian history or in the coming about of the Indian nation.
Correct. Yes, absolutely, you're right. And I think it was James Mill who first said, who divided our history.
1818.
That's right, into the 1,000 years of, Muslim rule, and then the Hindus, and then, of course, the liberating British presence. But, this was such a noxious, toxic, and yet enduring way of narrating history. And then we have, of course, internalized that, and with the rise of nationalism, the way that the British described the Hindus and the Muslims, with the Hindus being almost like eunuchs and very weak, and the virile Muslims. So the Indian nationalists reacted to this, reality, and so they had the cult of the bodybuilders, and the wrestlers, and then to sort of promote the idea of Hindu manhood being virile as well. And of course, the woman becomes embodied into the figure of the goddess. So yes, I think we do need to sort of deconstruct these notions which have taken such a tenacious hold of our mind and our imagination, and understand where this ancient loathing has come from, and put back people, at least like the Mughals, in the context that they were, where they were truly magnificent, truly, glorious for their age, and the art and the culture that they left behind was truly trailblazing.
Yeah, in fact, it is because of this history that we have this sense of this grand patriarchy. There has been a lot of vilification of Muslim rule, particularly because they treat their women so poorly. And that is one thing I thought that came out so wonderfully well in this book, that they did not treat their women badly at all, at least not even the Mughal Padshahs. We don't know about the rest of the people because you are only speaking about the Mughal Padshahs and the Padshah Begums chiefly over here. And yet, there is something that was quite interesting. this whole idea of patriarchy that has been constructed over the years in all kinds of accounts, whether they were European accounts or others, certainly receives a setback. Because when you look at an emperor like Jahangir, now that particular chapter was also quite interesting, because I don't know, is it the way that you have looked at it or the particular perspective that you adopt? But Jahangir appears to be somebody who is quite weak and effete. Of course, he was a great king. He was the son of Akbar the Great. But Noor Jahan seems to tower over him in this account. Noor Jahan is this magnificent queen, and as I have mentioned, that she was tremendously powerful. Then we hear about Jahangir, who has this habit of consuming a good deal of opium, and he is very fond of his drink. He drinks so much that he becomes seriously ill for long periods of time, until Noor Jahan tries to tell him that you can only have 3 pegs and no more, or maybe a little more than that. And then there is this interesting description of how, after having his quota for the day, Jahangir is brought into his sleeping quarters, where Noor Jahan and other women, coddle him and, treat him like a little baby, undress him, and put him to bed. So the notion that I had in my head was that of this great, magnificent Jahangir. And yet, there he was no better than a little child. And so this allows this whole notion of patriarchy to be sidestepped and to see something much more significant instead.
Correct. And I don't think that is necessarily demeaning to any of the men or reduces them in any way. I think on the contrary, I think if we can see, for example, a Shah Jahan as a father who was so inordinately fond of his daughter that he gave her whatever powers she wanted and allowed her to express herself freely as an unmarried woman, I think that adds to his splendor, that adds another nuanced layer to his personality. Or as you say, Jahangir, if we see him, now why I talked about that particular episode is that often the Europeans, when they write exactly about this episode, and they tend to see it in sexual terms, and they say the women came and they undressed him, and put him to bed, and, ... But when I read it, and when I just looked through it through maybe different eyes, I realized that firstly, he married Noor Jahan, who was an older woman for her time. She wasn't a young, nubile woman. She was a mother already. She'd been widowed. And a lot of the Mughals, and especially Jahangir, had this adoration for the older woman, the matriarch, and they had a lot of respect for that. So when I saw this very scene, again, I said, well, this is what he trusts her implicitly, because she is an older woman who has his best interests in mind. And in fact, the fact that he used to drink too much, the only person he could trust to tell this to, and that he was unwell because of it, was Noor Jahan. He couldn't trust anybody else, because somebody could have poisoned him or have him killed. So this spoke to me a great deal, the fact that he trusted Noor Jahan, and she would come and chide him almost like a maternal figure and say, well, look what you've done to yourself, look at your state, now come on, we'll undress you. And little by little she gets him ready for bed and puts him to bed. But I don't think that demeans Jahangir in any way, so you see a different facet to his character. His vulnerability comes out, and you sort of think, yes, okay, this is a real man who I can believe in, and he had this side to him. But he was also able to accept his weakness and show it to Noor Jahan, who then, of course, did so much more with it herself.
As a matter of fact, what was good about the book was that you did, as you mentioned, bring out the vulnerabilities of these great men, because if women have this problem about being victimized, men also are victimized in the sense that they have to live as people that are larger than themselves, adopting a persona that they don't really have, exhibiting a kind of a masculinity, which must have been exceedingly difficult for men too. But even Shah Jahan, who comes after Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, who in fact brought in this bloody war of succession, the manner in which he sort of disembodies his brothers and prevents them from, keeping the throne, lets loose this tide of blood. And yet, even in Shah Jahan, there is this tremendous vulnerability, because he becomes the paternal figure. And that vulnerability is also visible when his son, Aurangzeb, does to him what he did a generation ago.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the figure of Jahanara. And you've written a chapter in your earlier book, Heroines, as well, on Jahanara. You mentioned Jahanara. Jahanara is daughter of Shah Jahan and a sister of Aurangzeb. Jahanara is mentioned in the most splendid terms. Jahanara is mentioned as this extremely accomplished woman. And when Shah Jahan, after the death of Mumtaz Mahal, during the construction of the Taj Mahal, decides to move to Delhi and to create a whole new capital over there, which would then be known as Shah Jahanabad, the entire harem goes with him. And one of the very prominent figures, along with all his wives, is Jahanara, perhaps really one of the wealthiest women in the world. And Jahanara, uses her time, spends a good deal of her time in the building of this magnificent city, Shah Jahanabad. In fact, Ira, I had no idea that Chandni Chowk, which still exists, was engineered, was built, was raised by Jahanara. And she's the one who then, also was involved in the construction of caravanserais, several beautiful mosques, a number of beautiful gardens, and of course, much else besides. So can you speak a little bit about her?
Yes, definitely. I think she's one of the reasons that I was attracted to writing, a history of the Mughals, because being a Delhi woman myself, when I realized how little I knew about Jahanara, I thought that was such a shame and such a scandalous loss really to all of us to lose the memory of a woman like Jahanara to such an extent. And as you were mentioning, in 1638, when Shah Jahan decided to build a brand new city, all he built really was, not all, he built the Red Fort and the walls and the Jama Masjid. And all the rest he gave over to his women and to his nobles. And I was astounded to read, when I started reading up about this, that Jahanara Begum built the entire middle section, for those of you who know Delhi, the section around Chandni Chowk, so that includes a huge caravanserai, which today is the town hall. But there was a magnificent, luxurious caravanserai there, and behind that, the Sahibabad Gardens, and in front of it, the hammams for the nobles of the city. So that entire middle section was dominated by her presence, so that people, travelers, and the residents of the city, whenever they used these facilities, they would remember her name, and her glory, she hoped, would be carried on into the future generations, Chandni Chowk itself. But sadly, what happened, of course, in 1857 was that when a lot of the structures, when the British took back Delhi, they destroyed a lot of the structures, not just to clear out space, but also specifically to remove the symbols of glory and power that preceded them. So it is very telling, I find, that all of Jahanara Begum's structures were destroyed at that time. Her caravanserai, the hammams, and the gardens were all laid low, and there's nothing physically left. Of course, Chandni Chowk, but it is a very much reduced version of what it was. So I felt that it was such a poignant thing that this woman who had created so much and who had hoped to stay in the memory of the people of Delhi for many generations was in a way completely forgotten. And she was such an extraordinary woman because she also considered herself a Sufi princess. And her parents, of course, are buried in the magnificent Taj Mahal. But for herself, she chose a tomb which was so completely at the opposite, spectrum. She chose to be buried in what she called a pauper's grave, but within the precinct of the divine Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. So, despite having all the money in the world, one of the richest women probably in the world at that time, she chose such a simple Sufi tomb for herself. But perhaps in her mind was her afterlife and immortality, so that through all the years to come, she would get the blessings of Nizamuddin Aulia.
In fact, I must tell everybody that the last part of the book is very sad because of the devastation. The epilogue particularly speaks about the devastation of Shah Jahanabad after 1857, after the revolt of 1857, when the British decided that they would build soldiers' barracks inside the magnificent Lal Killa. And the Lal Killa is also pretty much a reduced version of what it used to be.
80% was destroyed.
80% of it was destroyed. And I also read in your book that the Taj Mahal, which mercifully has not been destroyed, was used as a kind of a dancing floor, by the officers. And what a come down.
Correct.
What an amazing degradation, and how utterly pathetic and sad to change the course of history altogether. And even though this is a history that you might deplore because we speak about freedom from the Mughals, the Muslim rule, and then freedom from the British, to destroy everything is such a shame.
It is, but I think it's the way of the
It's
victors.
it's the way of the victors. They vanquish utterly those who exist before them. I think since we'll soon be running out of time, perhaps we can make way for some few questions from the audience. Yes, please, in man in blue, third row, gentleman in blue.
I must tell you firsthand that I have not yet read the book. My question